Then let's dive into CoreMedia single page application, or like we have to call it, Spark. Actually, I have no idea how the name came about, but it's a nice little name for our blueprint, specifically for the CoreMedia headless scenario. As you know, CoreMedia already ships with a number of blueprints for the classic delivery model. With Spark, we finally also have a blueprint, actually since a few years now, for the headless scenario. So I want to give you a quick introduction today on how that works, what is it, also typically more technical than I would typically do it. So let's dive though still within the topic with a quick demo, because I'm not sure if many people have seen Spark before. So let's dive right into this one. What you see on my screen, CoreMedia Studio, and that's one important aspect from a technology point of view for the user, the editor who's using CoreMedia. They shouldn't care, quite frankly, what's the technology in the front end. If it's a classic front end, CAE delivered, or if it's a headless setup with an independent front end. So all the functionality that you are used to, meaning the complete integration into the preview, that you can scroll through it, that you can click on all of those items, that you can use this nice little device slider here to see, for example, how your React app would look like on a tablet, or how it's going to look on a mobile device. All of that is included in the functionality of the Spark app. And we also have our little device switcher here on the left side. So you can, if you choose to in a project, have multiple delivery channels. As you know, CoreMedia is very keen on the idea of being omni-channel in delivery. So you can see I can also switch back into a classic CAE delivery just by selecting that item on my drop down. Again, doesn't have to be in a project. I just wanted to point out, because you can think about scenarios where a customer has a classic CAE rendered website, but want to use the same kind of content for a mobile application and chooses to render that mobile application in React or Angular or whatever the technology is. So in that case, you need to give the editor the option to switch. That's what our device switcher can do. And again, all the functionality, including something like time travel and all that, will come to this one with the React app. The React app, as it is right now, has already a set of templates. So all the creative content pieces that you get when you download a classic blueprint, you have that in here, including something like the image maps, where you can then go on a product detail page, and all that is part of that blueprint. However, one point that I really want to make, just like all of our blueprints, this is an example app. It's not production ready. All the transactional pieces, account pieces, checkout, order management, and all of that is not implemented. So this is really, from a project point of view, an example, starting point, nothing that you can go live with. Even when I think about non-retail scenario, non-B2C, non-B2B, you do not want to go live with this one as is. So there are a few things that you need to do, just like every blueprint. Just wanted to point that out to make that clear, that with the React app that we provide, and you can access the React app in our public repository. By the way, I will share the PowerPoint slides as well, so you get the link and all of those kind of things to this. You can download it. We have here our instructions on what to do and on all those kind of things. So it's a great starting point that you can access, and it's publicly available. So just scrolling through the few things, as I mentioned, doesn't make a difference what kind of front end it has. From the editorial point of view, everyone can do the same thing like they're already used to in our blueprints. You see, we have a little bit more modern styling, still React Basic in there, but I just want to point out there's already a nice little starting point for all the common content pieces. All right, then let's dive a little bit more into some facts and information about the Spark app. Spark itself is based on React 17 at this point. in time. We are constantly upgrading it, so I'm pretty sure it can change over time. But for now, it's on React 17. We use Apollo GraphQL as the communication pattern. I'm pretty sure you already are familiar with GraphQL, so I'm not going into too much detail about how that works. Just want to point out we're using Apollo here, and we definitely use site components for all kind of sightings that you have in here. So again, comes with the Spark app. The explainer, I want to make that a little bit more specific why this is not a production instance. So first of all, I want to point out that, or I already pointed out that these elements like order management, the transactional pieces in general, all of that is not included. And for most of the customer projects you will need that. Second piece is whenever we are talking about the retail scenario or B2B scenario in general, you have to have somewhat like a catalog behind it, where you find your products, your categories, and so on and so forth. And the way that we do this in the demo that you just saw, and I will get to the detail a little bit how that works, is also something you do not want to do in production. So use this as a front end to see how does it, or as an example for your front end to see how all those components go. You can steal components, side components, and all of that, but it's not the way. Click and install, and you're good to go. So how does setup currently look like? Very simple. We have our CoreMedia Content Cloud system here on the left side. So CoreMedia Content Cloud compared to the classic delivery, we are not using the CRE to render. We are using our headless service. Headless service communication in JSON using GraphQL as the query language in here. And this one is connected. Spark here is not directly connected to the headless server. It's going through a stitching. So a stitching server allows you to connect multiple GraphQL interfaces so that the front end only communicates with one backend, so to speak, even though multiple systems behind the scenes, and you can extend that, of course. Stitching is the simplest way of getting multiple backends into one communication channel, if I can call it like this. There's also the example for backend for frontend. Come to that one in a second. Just want to finish up our setup. How we use it in our demos is that the stitching server, as I mentioned, is connected to what we call the headless service connector. So you are most likely already familiar with our commerce adapters. Commerce adapters sitting basically on top of the commerce system, so you can communicate that. But the commerce adapters are typically connected to our CAE or the studio. In our case, we repurposed that and added an additional component, the headless service add-on, so to speak, for the commerce adapter, so that we have now a GraphQL interface for that commerce adapter to communicate. So I can do something super simple. I can go to basically my commerce adapter and say, please give me the price for this kind of project. So that component that you see in here, the headless commerce service with the asterisk, is a labs project. It's available to you. The same with the stitching service. These are available to you again to see how that works. Don't use it as is, just same description as before, but just wanted to give you a quick point out how we handle this in general. And the target architecture that you want to go to, thinking here only, by the way, delivery perspective only, right? Editorial piece is in the CoreMedia Content Cloud box on a different kind of node. So from a target architecture perspective, you have your custom frontend. That's Spark, maybe based on Spark, but it's not Spark as it is. And that one is talking to a backend for frontend. A backend for frontend typically does a lot more than just stitching GraphQL communications to multiple endpoints together. It typically does things like caching of components. It can, or you can add business logic into that layer. It's a classic, almost classic middleware scenario that you can build in. Definitely recommend to not have the front end directly communicating with backends, specifically not if you have multiple backends. So you always want to have something like a backend for front end. How thick or thin that layer is project specific. Just want to point that one out. And again, here we have then, instead of talking through our labs version that enables our commerce adapter to communicate with GraphQL, you do not want to use it because, again, that is only for demo purposes, no transactional, no order management. I repeat myself, not in there. So you want to use something like a headless service from your commerce platform. Some of them have that already out of the box, commerce tools, for example. Some of them don't. So you might need to consider that whatever your customer has as a commerce system, you might also have to consider how to communicate with the commerce system through the backend for frontend. So when I speak about architecture, and I talked about the question about how to communicate, so typically I go into the request flow as the next talking point here. And actually, it's quite kind of straightforward, right? We have client and server. In this case, server here is the backend for frontend and everything behind that. So I'm kind of made myself a little bit easy going in here. You request the application from the client and you return typically an base frame of that application. That can be everything like you already rendered the navigation or the header and the footer. You have something even more simple, but you need to return something to the client that it can work on. The actual content is something that you request afterwards. You request it in the second step. So when you request the application in general, as I mentioned, you can already have static components that are already available. That gives you a very quick first bite. So you want to keep that in the level of very simple and small, so it's quick, but it also has something in it for you to give the viewer or the user at the end something that they see. All right, that's what I was requesting for is coming very quickly. And as I mentioned, you can, that's a nice little thing of GraphQL or Headless, the communication pattern in general is that you can now load only the content pieces that you actually need. For a simple scenario, only the content pieces that are above the fold, so what the user is currently using, and only in the second step, load the content that is below it when the user scrolls. Or if you have tabbed components, you could load only the first element or the first element of the carousel, the first slide of the carousel, and so on and so forth. It's a nice little thing of GraphQL as a communication pattern compared to very defined interfaces where you get always the same kind of content. With GraphQL, you can really fine tune what exactly you want to load. Recommendation from our side, try to stay within 5 additional requests. We certainly do want to keep the balance between underfetching and overfetching. Underfetching where we communicate too often, and it's just a chatty situation here between the client and the backend in general. But we also do not want to deliver too much data because we try to do everything in too few calls. So try to find the balance in here, really consider what is needed for the project, what do you want to see, and what can you, from a strategic point of view, a technical point of view, what can you repurpose for multiple requests? Because, for example, if the user then navigates to something, you get the same kind of component or the same kind of request on a different kind of page. So let me just go for that one a little bit more into specific into our Spark code. So the request comes in, right? Somebody is opening up the URL /Calista, whatever it is. Calista is one of our demo sites that we use for all those who have worked with CoreMedia, for example, on the Salesforce site or whatnot. Calista is one of our blueprints that we have. The page frame, as I mentioned, is being initialized. What the page frame is can be everything from very static header to very static footer or parts of it, whatever you like. In our case, we can, for example, also load the navigation and render the navigation, the top level navigation there. In React, very classic, by the way, we are sticking to React and all kind of recommendations, techniques, patterns as every React basic component would do that. So we are trying to get anything CoreMedia specific out as much as possible, other than obviously styling and all these kind of things. But we do not want to add anything that is, how can I say this, not standard React or anything add-on wise, like we sometimes occasionally do in our front ends and our free marker-based CAE templates and all of those kind of things. We try to stay as close as possible to standard React implementation. So, and the router is defining with the app routes TSX file what is now really to render based on that URL segment. Is it a page, is it content, whatnot, communicating with the backend through Apollo, getting the data from the headless service, which then says, all right, that's a CM article, that's a CM page, or that's a CM collection, whatever it is. And we then render on individual components, that individual pieces, very much like you're already used to in our theme template. So again, this is not a full site that where we have one big template. We use the same principle here, kind of onion peeling scenario in individual components. Preview integration, big topic, must have for CoreMedia. I was always talking about the delivery side, but it also obviously includes how to make the editor see that preview in there. But it's actually very simple to integrate that with CoreMedia. Our product center made it very easy by allowing to configure that through a settings document. So by the way, the details of that are all available in our documentation. All you have to do is set up a setting. You define in the setting what kind of previews you have. Remember that drop-down menu that I showed you, and configure where's the URI template. And when you look at the URI template, that is an important aspect you should consider. Link building in general, compared to the very standard scenario of having a truly independent front end and a back end that only delivers data. In the scenario of a CMS and an editorial use case, you still need to consider what happens if the editor opens up that article directly from the CoreMedia library. So it's not like you want to see the preview and then you have to navigate to that article as the editor. You want to open that article and see on the right side the preview of that one article. So you need to have a way that you can address the individual items per URL. And you see that in here in the center screenshot, there are ways to kind of also have parameterized versions of that URL. Just need to consider when you build your own front end to have that in mind, and not just think about that the entry point in that application is always the root node. So as I mentioned, very simple, very straightforward. That's all you have to do to allow it. Might be some X-frame options here and there, but that's all that there is to it. And since I was talking about the little add-ons, you saw that in my preview that I used the preview-driven editing, the right mouse click thingy, that I used a slider. Something that we always support is, or time travel is, for example, always supported. Placement highlighter, all the things that editors are used to when they work with CoreMedia. Of course, we can also apply in headless frontend. Again, just by the way, I think I haven't mentioned that. We are using React in our example, but you can have any kind of frontends, right? You can have Angular, Vue, something I have not even heard about. That's an independent frontend. That's a nice little thing. You communicate with the JSON of the GraphQL in the backend, but you can apply all those nice little features to tie the preview into the studio. And here you see the ones that I would always keep in mind so that you make the life of the editor easy, from the device slider, so you attach the functionality and so on and so forth into it. You can look into our example app, how exactly the JavaScript is working on this side. But just as a reminder, there are also a few things if you have a common or custom front end that you want to include. So, and I think one more aspect, especially for those who are not familiar with Spark, is always, yeah, what's my first step? What's the first thing I need to do? You install Node, you install PnPN. Again, please always look into our documentation, which version of these is needed. In my case here, I have Node 16 and PnPN. Package manager for Node. These are the basics to install. The checkout, as I mentioned, the URL to the code base, to check it out, the GitHub workspace. And very important, don't forget about that. You create an environment file. So this is standard React, telling where is the backend, what's the configuration and all of that. We provide an example file so you can see how that looks like, but you just need to create a .env file for yourself and configure that. For example, where's the backend, where's my backend for the data where it is ready to communicate. And there are a few other things very well documented in that example file, as well as in our documentation that you find in GitHub as well. Then you just install PnPN, downloading all the necessary libraries and resources, PnPN build, building that whole workspace. And then you just switch into the application Spark and run. Why Spark? Well, because as I mentioned, we ship with also the example stitching server, for example, or a mock backend. So we provide that in that whole Headless React PWA client. We also provide you with those examples for the stitching server and so on. So you got to switch into the application specific Spark application and start the connection. And it works the same from an editorial point of view. It works the same way as our developer front end, meaning you can also connect to a deployed CoreMedia instance and have it connected to your local running Spark app, so you can do the front-end development, as I mentioned, like you're used to in the CAE development. Technically speaking, of course, they are slightly, or actually quite different on how that works, but from the editorial perspective, from the workflow perspective, from the developer, has the same features and the same functionalities in there. Once you started the application, you can always address it under localhost 3000. Our standard site here, Calista, as I mentioned, if you have multiple sites on your CoreMedia instance, then you address the one that you would like. I already talked about so much about what have we done with CAE and Spark, and everything works the same way. There are differences between websites, a headless scenario and website, and a head-based scenario, meaning implementation features and details of the CAE and the Spark app. I listed them in here, and I think I should not go through all of those. I just want to point out a few important elements that we have in there. So theming. It's React, it's site components, it's no longer a free marker. You still have something like, of course, CSS and JavaScript and all that, but it's not in the theme scenario where you build out a standard theme and then you have a theme on top of that. React just simply doesn't work that way. So you have a more straightforward, you have your CSSs and you can work with those kind of things, and you don't have this additional add-on of a theme concept like we have it in our CAE. Link building, I guess that's an additional topic that I just want to talk about. Remember that when I was pointing out this one scenario about you are in the studio, you go in the library, you open up an article and you see an article. So the link building itself is of course compatible with the CAE, but it's not that completely detailed in that CAE, and you need to consider that when you build out your independent front end, that you make sure that the concept behind it still works with the requirements from the editorial perspective towards the and not just the delivery version where you navigate from this one root entry point all the way down. The deployment, as I mentioned, is slightly different. You have now this middle layer in between, so not just the CAE and then everything is done. You have your independent front end, you have the CoreMedia Headless server delivering JSON, and you definitely want to have something like a backend to front end middleware in between in here. We support all of those kind of components, but for example, in our CoreMedia's Content Cloud service offer, the one where we host CoreMedia, the whole application hosting of your front end as well as the backend is not within CoreMedia's service offering included. So you have to host that, for example, somewhere else. Lastly, what I typically hear when I speak about React in specific, but again, might be the same for Angular or Vue, is the UI component explorers. So that the connection between the actual designer of a new component and the developer is a little bit closer. Right now, you have to kind of, in CAE, you have to, or you typically draw it somewhere in Photoshop or whatever the designer is using, and then you have to put it into HTML markup. In React, there are often some ways to do this a little bit more straightforward, so that the designer who's designing that front-end components already produces some kind of React app, some React code. And we use a storybook in our demo, and I think we have made very good experience with that, that you can have something like not only for the creational process, so that you don't have to run the full application all the time, just focus on your one teaser, your one banner, your one slider, whatever it is. And you use something like Storybook to design those components, which also can then make your life a little bit easier when you think about testing, or if you have a new styling, if you have a new, I don't know, if you want to switch the website into something to fresher layout or whatnot, then using something like those UI component explorer makes it easier to work with. And that was it for my super quick, I know, introduction into Spark. My goal was really to give you an overview about what's available, how to use it, what are the differences between the themes that you're already used to. Just want to point out, because my product center asked me for this, if you want to give feedback to any kind of product, CoreMedia product, feel free to join our feedback program. That's why I added that little QR code to it. Just put that one aside. Feel free also to connect to me. You see my connection details in here. Otherwise, I would say questions. Go ahead.